Daniel Riker blended into the crowd like any other face in the city. Quiet, forgettable, invisible. Just blocks away, Maria Alvarez held her daughter's hand, laughing under the lights of the West End Street Festival, unaware that a man she'd never met had already marked this night for horror. As the sun dipped behind the Vancouver skyline, these two lives, one filled with joy, the other with rage, were on a collision course that would leave a city shattered and searching for answers. It was a warm, sunny Saturday evening in Vancouver, and the city streets were alive with excitement. The West End Street Festival, one of the most anticipated events of the year, had drawn a massive crowd. Families, tourists, and locals wandered through the festival, creating a colorful tapestry of people. Music echoed down the tree-lined avenues as local bands played their tunes, filling the air with an energy that matched the vibrancy of the event. The scent of grilled meats, sweet treats, and freshly brewed coffee mingled in the atmosphere, tempting visitors to stop by the food stands and sample the wide variety of delicacies on offer. Children darted between the booths, their faces painted with bright colors, while couples strolled hand in hand, taking in the sights and sounds. The festival was a celebration of Vancouver's cultural diversity, with food stalls and crafts representing the many different communities that called the city home. It was a day meant for joy and connection, a chance to relax, enjoy good company, and celebrate life in the heart of the city. The streets were bustling, but everything felt safe and organized, as families gathered to enjoy the summer evening together. As night began to fall, the mood shifted slightly, with a cool breeze rolling in from the nearby ocean. The lights from the food trucks and market stalls cast a soft glow over the crowd, adding to the festive atmosphere. It was the perfect evening, bright, lively, and full of life. For many, the festival felt like a brief escape from the usual routines of everyday life, offering a space to reconnect with others and experience the city in a new way. But as the festivities continued, there was a sense that something was off, a feeling that, for some, went unnoticed amid the laughter and music. A few people noticed a black sedan driving slowly through the festival, its engine humming steadily. It appeared to be out of place, its speed unremarkable at first, but the car's presence lingered in the back of their minds. No one knew then that this seemingly innocent moment would soon spiral into an unimaginable tragedy. The calm before the storm was palpable, a fleeting moment in time when all seemed right with the world, before everything changed forever. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere at the festival began to change subtly. The music played on, the crowds continued to wander through the food stands, and the air remained filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter. But for some, a strange feeling of unease had begun to creep into the scene. At the edge of the festival, a black sedan had been seen driving slowly past, its tinted windows reflecting the lights of the stalls. At first, no one paid much attention. It was a busy event, and vehicles occasionally drove through the area, making their way through traffic to avoid street closures. But something about this particular car stood out. The sedan circled the perimeter of the festival a few times, and its presence seemed increasingly erratic. It wasn't moving with the flow of traffic, but rather weaving in and out of the street, as if the driver couldn't decide where to go. People who noticed it exchanged uneasy glances, but no one thought much of it. Just a distracted driver maybe trying to find parking. Yet as time passed, more and more people couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The car didn't belong, and it wasn't behaving like a typical vehicle trying to navigate through the festival crowd. Some said they saw the driver glance toward the festival goers, and others described how the car revved its engine louder than necessary. A few festival goers even moved to the side of the street, instinctively stepping away from the vehicle as it passed them. They couldn't have known, of course, but something told them to keep their distance. Their instincts, it seemed, had been right. Still, for the most part, the evening continued on as if nothing had changed. People laughed, danced, and enjoyed the beautiful summer evening, unaware that they were mere moments away from a terrifying tragedy. Then, without warning, the sedan's engine roared louder than before. The vehicle swerved sharply toward the center of the festival, accelerating. with a speed and force that made the crowd panic. It was no longer just a car passing by. It was a looming threat, barreling directly into the heart of the celebration. For those who witnessed it, the first moments of the attack felt surreal, almost as if time had slowed down. And in those fleeting seconds, a quiet, sunny evening turned into something none of them could have ever imagined. The car lunged forward, crashing into the crowd with terrifying force. The sound of its engine, once a mere hum in the background, now became the unmistakable roar of destruction. People screamed in horror as the sedan plowed through them, striking bystanders with a brutal, relentless speed. The pavement, once smooth and welcoming underfoot, now became a deadly trap. Festival-goers were sent flying in every direction, their joyous evening instantly transformed into a nightmare. The car didn't slow down. It simply barreled through the crowd, crushing anything and anyone in its path. Vendors' tents were torn apart, their colorful fabrics shredded as the vehicle slammed into food stands and tables. People who had been walking casually, laughing with friends, or holding their children's hands, were sent sprawling across the street. A wave of panic swept through the crowd, and a stampede ensued as people tried desperately to escape the path of the speeding vehicle. But it was impossible to predict where the car would turn next. It weaved back and forth, forcing people to dive into the nearby alleys or leap behind anything they could find for cover. Amid the chaos, people cried out for help, their voices muffled by the sound of screeching tires and the thud of bodies being struck. The smell of burnt rubber filled the air, mixing with the unmistakable scent of blood and fear. Children, once full of life, were separated from their parents, some wandering aimlessly, others trapped beneath fallen debris. The festival that had been full of joy and excitement just moments before now felt like a scene from a nightmare. It felt as if the car had been on a mission to destroy, hitting as many people as it could in its reckless path. The horror didn't stop when the car finally veered off course and came to a halt. For those who survived the initial impact, the aftermath was equally traumatic. The street was strewn with overturned tables, shattered glass, and the crumpled remains of food stands. The air, once filled with music and laughter, was now eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of sirens approaching and the soft groans of the injured. In the few moments that followed, no one knew what had just happened. The chaos was so overwhelming, so inexplicable, that the entire scene seemed to exist outside of reality. The only certainty in those first few moments was the devastation that had already been wrought. The peaceful festival was no more. In its place stood a scene of horror, one that no one could have anticipated, and which would forever change the city of Vancouver. As the car finally came to a halt, the deafening screech of its tires echoed through the now silent streets. The once bustling festival grounds were now eerily still, save for the distant wail of sirens growing louder by the second. People who had been caught in the chaos were scattered across the street, some motionless, others writhing in pain. The overwhelming sense of disbelief hung in the air, as bystanders slowly began to process what had just unfolded before their eyes. What had started as an evening of celebration was now a scene of unimaginable horror. Emergency responders arrived, quickly, their sirens cutting through the heavy silence. Paramedics and police officers rushed to the scene, springing into action as they began to assess the damage. But there was little they could do in those first few minutes, but try to secure the area and tend to the victims who were still conscious. The bodies of those who had been struck by the car lay sprawled across the street, some under the wreckage of food stalls, others tangled in a mess of broken chairs, tables, and debris. The sight of the dead and the injured was a grotesque contrast to the lively atmosphere that had filled the streets only an hour earlier. The victims who were still breathing were quickly attended to, but many were in critical condition, their injuries so severe that it was unclear whether they would survive. Blood pooled in the cracks of the pavement, a chilling reminder of the violence that had just occurred. Witnesses, many of whom had been in shock just moments ago, now huddled together, some crying, others too stunned to speak. The overwhelming emotions were hard to process. Grief, fear, anger, and confusion swirled through the crowd as the enormity of what had just happened began to sink in. Among the chaos, a few brave individuals tried to help the injured, using whatever they could find: scarves, jackets, even their own hands. to stop the bleeding or provide comfort. But the scene was far beyond their ability to control. It wasn't just a festival that had been shattered, it was the sense of safety that people had once felt in the city, now fractured beyond recognition. The air, once filled with the sounds of joy and laughter, now carried the heavy weight of tragedy. Vancouver, a city known for its peace and tranquility, was now grappling with a nightmarish reality no one could have prepared for. The lives of many would never be the same again. In the hours following the attack, investigators scrambled to piece together the fragments of the horrifying scene. The police had secured the area, establishing a perimeter around the wreckage and cordoning off the festival grounds as they worked to gather evidence. The bodies of the victims were carefully removed from the scene, their names still unknown to the officers on site. The devastation was overwhelming. At least 10 people were confirmed dead, and dozens more were injured, many of them critically. The scale of the tragedy was unlike anything the city had ever seen. The first step for investigators was to identify the driver. Within minutes of the car coming to a stop, police had apprehended the man behind the wheel. He had been found sitting in the car, stunned and seemingly disoriented. He didn't attempt to flee. He didn't resist. His eyes were vacant, as if he couldn't fully comprehend the carnage he had just caused. The officers, knowing that this would be the key to understanding what had happened, moved quickly to gather information. His name, they learned, was Daniel Riker. At first, the authorities were hesitant to jump to conclusions. They knew they needed more information before making any judgments. Was this a random act of violence? A reckless driver losing control? Or was it something more sinister? Witnesses told conflicting stories about the car's behavior in the moments before the attack. Some described it swerving dangerously between traffic, while others said it had appeared to intentionally target the crowd. As officers sifted through the chaos, trying to make sense of the conflicting reports, one thing became clear. The driver, Daniel Riker, had intentionally aimed his vehicle at the heart of the festival. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras began to surface, and investigators studied the images carefully. It was undeniable. Riker had deliberately accelerated toward the crowd, weaving through the festival goers with a clear, disturbing purpose. There was no sign of a mechanical failure or any attempt to avoid the people. This wasn't an accident. It was an attack. As they dug deeper into Riker's background, the story began to unravel in unsettling ways. The man in question wasn't just an ordinary person. He wasn't a random individual who had simply lost control of his vehicle. His life was much darker than anyone could have imagined. In the midst of the horror, the investigation revealed that Riker had a criminal history, one that spanned years and hinted at a pattern of violent behavior. This wasn't a random act. This was a premeditated tragedy, and the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But it wasn't just his criminal past that was shocking. It was what lay beneath the surface, what had driven him to commit such a horrific act that would soon come to light in the investigation. As investigators dug deeper into Daniel Riker's past, the chilling details began to surface. Riker wasn't a stranger to violence. His criminal record painted a picture of a man with a deep-seated anger that had been simmering for years. His history wasn't just marked by one or two isolated incidents. It was a consistent pattern of reckless behavior, violence, and a growing sense of isolation. Riker had been arrested multiple times over the years, with charges ranging from assault to reckless driving. Each time, he had managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system, often receiving only minimal punishment. His outbursts had escalated over time, but no one had ever fully understood the depth of his rage. Riker had grown up in Vancouver, but his relationship with the city was complicated. His family life had been unstable from an early age. Raised by a single mother who struggled with addiction, Riker had spent much of his childhood bouncing between foster homes. As a teenager, he became increasingly withdrawn, finding solace in his own bitterness rather than in the world around him. He had never quite fit in, either at school or in the community. His classmates remember him as quiet, even a bit strange, but it wasn't until later that they began to realize just how troubled he truly was. In his early 20s, Riker's behavior took a darker turn. His anger, once directed at small frustrations, began to manifest in more destructive ways. He was involved in a series of violent altercations, some of which had been public and had left people seriously injured. But Riker was always able to avoid long-term consequences, using his charm and manipulation to get out of trouble. His criminal record had been marked with multiple stints in jail, but each time he was released, and each time he seemed to come out more agitated, more disconnected from reality. But there was something more insidious about Riker. He wasn't just acting out of impulse or frustration. In the months leading up to the attack, he had become obsessed with a sense of alienation, a growing contempt for the people around him, especially the city's diverse population. He had become fixated on the festivals and cultural events that brought people together, events like the one in the West End that he would later target. His online activity had become increasingly erratic, filled with posts that bordered on the extreme. Riker had been consumed by conspiracy theories and radical ideologies, often sharing disturbing rants about his disdain for the multicultural liberal city that he felt had rejected him. It was clear that these beliefs had become a central part of his identity. He wasn't just angry at society, he was at war with it. The festival, with its celebration of everything he despised, had become the perfect target. Riker had planned the attack with chilling precision. He had scouted the festival multiple times in the weeks leading up to the event, studying the crowds and the layout of the street. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a calculated act of violence, a way for Riker to make a statement. His hatred had festered over time, and the festival, with its joyful crowds and diverse atmosphere, had become the perfect outlet for his rage. What had once seemed like a random, senseless attack now appeared to be something much darker. Riker wasn't just a troubled individual caught in a moment of madness. He was someone who had planned and executed a horrific act, driven by a deep and twisted ideology that had consumed him over the years. The investigation was only beginning, but it was already clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the result of a lifetime of anger, hatred, and resentment that had finally exploded in the most tragic way imaginable. As the investigation into Daniel Riker's background deepened, the true extent of his motivations began to emerge. It wasn't just his criminal record or his violent tendencies that painted a disturbing picture. It was his increasingly radicalized beliefs. In the months leading up to the attack, Riker had become consumed by a dark and toxic ideology, one that rejected the very essence of Vancouver's diversity. His online presence had become a window into a mind warped by resentment and a deep sense of alienation. The rants he posted were filled with venomous rhetoric, targeting everything from the city's multiculturalism to the people he blamed for his personal failures. Riker had fallen down a rabbit hole of extremist online forums, where hatred and division were constantly stoked. He surrounded himself with like-minded individuals, finding a distorted sense of belonging in groups that echoed his views. He was no longer just a disillusioned loner. He was part of something bigger, something that reinforced his growing sense of entitlement and anger. His posts were filled with words of contempt for the city's celebrations of different cultures, festivals, and events that showcased the diversity that made Vancouver a unique place to live. In Riker's mind, these events were a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. The more he seethed with hatred, the more his resentment grew, until he began to see himself as a crusader, someone who needed to take action to rid the world of what he saw as an infestation of people who didn't belong. His fixation on the West End Street Festival, with its celebration of different cultures, food, and music, wasn't a coincidence. It had become a symbol of everything he despised. Riker had attended the festival before, and each time his anger boiled over as he watched families and tourists laughing, enjoying the very things he had come to resent. For him, the festival was a target, a microcosm of the multicultural city he loathed. He began planning the attack with chilling precision. Riker studied the festival's layout, timing, and the flow of foot traffic, all the while growing more obsessed with the idea of striking it down. In the days leading up to the festival, Riker's online activity became even more erratic. His posts grew darker, his words more threatening. He began talking about taking action, of making a statement, of purging the city of what he saw as an infection. It was clear that he had made up his mind. He would take the lives of those he deemed unworthy in order to make his point, to make his hate felt in the most violent way possible. But he wasn't simply acting out of impulse or rage. Riker saw himself as a martyr, a lone soldier fighting against the forces he believed were corrupting society. The planning wasn't rushed. Over the course of several weeks, he methodically prepared for the attack, choosing the festival as the perfect venue to execute his vision of destruction. He had even started to rehearse the steps in his mind, how he would drive into the crowd, how he would make the ultimate statement of defiance. The car he used for the attack had been chosen carefully, and he had made sure it was in working condition. It wasn't just a moment of madness. It was a planned, deliberate act of violence, fueled by a belief system that had consumed him over time. Riker wasn't a random act of violence waiting to happen. He was a man who had been slowly stewing, in hatred, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when that moment came, he would not hesitate. The festival, with its joyful atmosphere and diverse crowd, became the perfect canvas for his hatred. What was meant to be a celebration of life had, in his twisted mind, become a symbol of everything he wanted to destroy. The horror of the attack rippled through Vancouver, leaving the city grappling with a sense of disbelief that would linger for months to come. A peaceful community, known for its diverse cultures, natural beauty, and vibrant festivals, had been shattered in an instant. What had been a joyful, sun-soaked evening filled with laughter and excitement had transformed into a scene of devastation, with the tragic loss of innocent lives and the brutal injuries of dozens more. The city, which had long prided itself on its safety and harmony, now faced the grim reality of a violent act that no one could have anticipated. As news of the attack spread, shock turned into anger. The streets, which had been bustling with people just hours earlier, now seemed eerily silent. The once celebratory mood was replaced with grief, confusion, and fear. Residents of the West End, particularly those who had witnessed the carnage firsthand, found themselves questioning how such an act of violence could occur in their own backyard. Many wondered how a man like Daniel Riker could have slipped through the cracks, unnoticed by those who might have been able to intervene before it was too late. Families mourned their loved ones, and the injured faced long, uncertain recoveries. The faces of the victims, many of whom were visiting from other parts of the world, were on the news and in newspapers, reminding everyone of the human cost of the attack. Memorials began to spring up in the city, with flowers, candles, and handwritten messages left in remembrance of those who had died. It was a city in mourning, struggling to come to terms with the fact that something so terrible had happened in a place that had always felt safe. But amid the grief, there was also an outpouring of support. Strangers helped one another in ways they hadn't before. The city's resilience began to show through the cracks in its broken heart. People came together to share their stories, to remember those who had been lost, and to support the families who were left behind. In the wake of tragedy, the community was forced to confront the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface. The attack on the festival was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of how fragile life could be, and how quickly a sense of safety could be shattered. As investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of Riker's planning and motivations, the city of Vancouver began to ask difficult questions. How could a man like Riker, with his disturbing history, have been allowed to roam free for so long? What signs had been missed? What could have been done differently? These questions would not go away, and they would hang over the city long after the immediate aftermath of the attack had passed. The attack on the West End Street Festival was not just a horrific tragedy, it was a turning point for Vancouver. The city would never be the same. The sense of safety that had once defined the city, especially during events like the festival, would never fully return. People would be more cautious, more aware of the risks lurking in a world where violence could strike without warning. Yet even in the face of such fear and grief, the spirit of Vancouver's community remained unbroken. The city had suffered a devastating loss, but its heart, though battered, continued to beat with resilience. The people of Vancouver would rebuild, but they would always carry with them the memory of that fateful night, the night that forever changed their city. As the investigation into Daniel Riker's attack continued, the police began to uncover more about his personal life and how he had come to harbor such hatred toward the people he had targeted. What had initially seemed like a random, senseless act of violence now appeared to be the culmination of years of deepening anger and radicalization. The more they learned, the more they realized that Riker had been carefully plotting the attack. For months, every detail had been meticulously planned, and every move had been calculated. Riker's obsession with violence had only grown in recent years. He had isolated himself further from the world, retreating into an echo chamber of online communities that reinforced his increasingly extremist views. His isolation from his family had been absolute. He had severed ties with his mother years ago, and he had no close friends who could challenge his warped beliefs. The only relationships he maintained were with the faceless individuals he communicated with on online forums. It was in these virtual spaces that Riker found validation for his anger and hatred, and where he learned to see the world as a battleground, with people like him fighting for survival against forces he believed were out to destroy everything he stood for. As the authorities continued to examine Riker's online activity, they discovered a growing pattern of messages, posts, and videos that hinted at his violent intentions. He had been posting increasingly troubling content, including detailed plans for an attack. His obsession with the West End Street Festival had not been an impulse. It had been part of a larger, more disturbing vision. For Riker, this was not just about one night of violence. It was about sending a message, about striking fear into a city he despised. He had fantasized about his actions for months, seeing himself as a martyr in his own twisted cause, as someone who would finally make the world sit up and take notice of his pain. The more the investigators pieced together Riker's movements in the weeks leading up to the attack, the more they realized that no one had seen the signs. No one had realized how deep his obsession had run, or how dangerous he had become. While his family and friends had written him off as a loner, the truth was far more sinister. Riker had built a secret life online, one that had allowed him to hide in plain sight. His behavior had become increasingly erratic, but no one had connected the dots in time to stop him. The lack of intervention was a haunting realization. Authorities couldn't help but wonder if there had been a way to reach Riker before the violence escalated. Could someone have noticed the signs of radicalization? Could someone have stepped in to offer him help before he reached the point of no return? These questions lingered, unresolved as the city continued to process the tragedy. Despite the devastation, the investigation was not without its breakthroughs. Evidence was mounting, and Riker was eventually charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. The justice system would eventually offer its verdict, but that could never undo the harm he had caused. The victims, their families, and the community were left to grapple with the aftermath. The lives lost that day could never be returned, and the scars on Vancouver's psyche would remain for years to come. But the investigation and the pursuit of justice would continue, driven by the need to understand how a man like Daniel Riker could carry out such a horrific attack, and what, if anything, could be done to prevent similar tragedies in the future. As the trial of Daniel Riker began, the entire city of Vancouver seemed to hold its breath. The courtroom was filled with the families of the victims, the media, and concerned citizens, all waiting for answers. The evidence against Riker was overwhelming. His planning had been meticulous, his motives clear. He had carefully crafted his path of destruction, and every detail of his attack had been mapped out long before the festival began. Yet even with the mounting evidence, the trial became more than just a quest for justice. It became a reflection of the city's collective grief and its search for meaning in the face of such senseless violence. The survivors of the attack, many of whom were still struggling to recover physically and emotionally, took the stand to recount the horrors they had witnessed. Some spoke about the terror they felt as they tried to escape, their lives narrowly spared as they darted for safety. Others described the traumatic aftermath, their lives forever changed by the violence they had witnessed and the friends and loved ones they had lost. For them, the trial wasn't just about holding Riker accountable. It was about finding closure, trying to make sense of the unimaginable loss, and understanding why this had happened in the first place. But no amount of legal proceedings could undo the pain they had suffered. Riker, meanwhile, sat stoically in the courtroom. His expression was cold, devoid of emotion, as the evidence was presented and the testimonies unfolded. To those watching, it seemed as though he was entirely disconnected, from the horror he had inflicted on so many. Some speculated that he had become so consumed by his own ideology and hatred that he no longer saw the victims as real people. In his mind, they were simply collateral damage in his crusade against a world he could not accept. His lack of remorse was chilling, and it only deepened the sense of injustice that hung over the trial. As the trial wore on, the community began to shift its focus. The questions about how someone like Riker had slipped through the cracks, how his radicalization had gone unnoticed for so long, began to gain more attention. What had led him down this dark path? What could have been done to prevent the attack?